I got to see Steve Marriott play with Humble Pie. This was right after Peter Frampton left the group. I had great seats close to the front of the stage. My first thought back then was how small he was to have such a huge voice. He had a great singing voice, very powerful and commanding. His guitar playing was excellent. He could rock it out and really get down on the blues too. When he got on the mic to speak, I leaned forward to pay attention to what he had to say. He was a ball of energy and full of charisma up there. I think many in the crowd felt that way. He owned the stage that night. Humble Pie was a great band, no questions about it. But there wasn't a doubt in my mind after that concert that Steve Marriott was the star of that group. I feel very fortunate today that I got to see him that night so long ago. He was one of the best on-stage performers I've ever seen. What happened to Steve Marriott in the music business is just a shame. I know it happens to a lot of talented musicians, and most of them survive it and live to tell about it. But sadly, Steve just didn't. Stephen Peter Marriott was born in London, England, January 30th, 1947. He was born 3 weeks premature and weighing in at just 4 pounds 4 ounces. Growing up, Steve was considered a hyperactive child. He came from a musical background, his father Bill being an accomplished pub pianist. Bill bought Steve a ukulele and a harmonica, and Steve taught himself to play the instruments at an early age. He seemed to have a natural ability to pick up a musical instrument and, within no time, be able to make some music with it. At age 12, Steve formed his first band with some school friends. They were called the Wheels, later the Coronation Kids, and finally Mississippi 5. From a young age, Steve was a huge fan of Buddy Holly and would mimic his hero by wearing large rimmed glasses after removing the lenses. The band formed and won a talent contest at the holiday camp in Clacton-on-the-Sea. His parents, seeing the talent in their 13-year-old son, pushed him toward the stage. In 1960, he won an audition to be one of several Artful Dodgers characters in the West End production of Lionel Bart's successful musical, Oliver. After that, he then formed a group, The Moments, and they began working London pubs and club circuits. Although small in stature, standing just a little over 5 foot tall, Steve Marriott was blessed with a powerful voice. He was full of energy and loaded with talent. Steve would impress many who saw him perform. Now, as the story goes, a couple of musicians in The Outcast, bass player Ronnie Lane and drummer Kenny Jones, had Steve come sit in with the group. Soon after that, they went to Steve's house to see if he wanted to start a group with them, singing and playing guitar. He was interested, and Steve suggested Jimmy Winston as a keyboard player to complete the 4-piece group. The next night, Ronnie, Kenny, and Steve visited Ruskin Arms to see Winston play and invite him to join the band. The following day, the band soon would be known as Small Faces and had their first rehearsal at the Ruskin Arms Pub and Hotel. A quick note here. Around this time, Steve and his friend David Bowie were talking about forming a group and naming it David and Goliath, but it wasn't to be. The group was named Small Faces since none of the members were over 5 foot 6 inches tall, and faces in the mod culture being an accolade bestowed upon respected mods. They were signed to Don Arden and quickly became a successful band, highly regarded by the youth's cult followers when their debut single, What You Gonna Do About It, busted out on the UK singles chart. A little about Don Arden here, as it will give a little more insight to Steve and his many money and management issues that would plague him throughout his career. Don Arden, in a career that spans 60 years, has promoted and managed some of the biggest names in pop music. His ruthless business dealings and willingness to intimidate both his clients and his competitors earned him the nickname the Al Capone of pop. This guy, for most all information available, was a first-class thug. In 1965, he signed Small Faces and ensured their debut single was a hit by outlaying several £100 to chart fixers. Arden kept the highly successful band on a £20 a week salary, while letting them enjoy a clothing allowance and giving them a place to live. When the band demanded to see their royalty statements in 1966, he countered by informing their parents that the band were drug addicts. He screwed them over left and right after that. The band broke free from him in 1968, around the time Steve Marriott threw up his hands, walked off stage, and left Small Faces. All attempts at retrieving royalties due from Arden found them locked in court battles, finally receiving some payment in 1977. After Steve left, Small Faces got Rod Stewart and Ronnie Woods and reformed as just the Faces, and were together up until 1975, when Rod left to go solo and Ronnie left to join the Rolling Stones. Shortly after leaving Small Faces, Steve joined in and helped form rock band Humble Pie, with Peter Frampton, drummer Jerry Shirley, and bassist Greg Ridley. In the early years, Humble Pie allowed Marriott the artistic songwriting freedom he so desired, but was denied in Small Faces, due in part to commercial pressure and individual differences. In short, Steve Marriott was ready to rock. After rehearsals at his Clear Sound home recording studio and some hard work, the band released on immediate label their debut album, As Safe as Yesterday Is. It was a very good album, and you could tell the band had a sound going. It was followed by the Marriott-penned debut single, Natural Born Boogie, and it peaked at number 4 in the UK singles chart in the summer of 1969. Humble Pie was off and running. But after a tour, they came back to Britain to find out that Immediate was going bankrupt. So they ended up hiring Dee Anthony to manage them, and they transferred to A&M Records and focused all their attention on the lucrative U.S. market. Humble Pie toured constantly over the next 3 years, completing 19 tours in the U.S. alone. The band's next album releases, Humble Pie and Rock On, benefited from their touring. Their live album performance, Rockin' the Fillmore in 1971, became the band's most successful release to date. During these recordings, Marriott's strong vocal performances became the focal point of the band. And this is where Dee Anthony started pushing Steve to take more of the onstage spotlight, something he had up to then been sharing with Frampton and Ridley. Marriott's new prominence is said to have resulted in Frampton's decision to leave the band. The band recorded Rockin' at the Fillmore in May of '71, and then in September of 1971, Frampton left to try it solo. He was replaced by Clem Clemson. Once the band started touring America steadily, Steve admits himself that his alcohol and drug use escalated. He says he would drink and take some speed when he was with Small Faces, but after he got Humble Pie up and rolling, it increased, and from all information out there, he just went from bad to worse. The way Steve's career played out after that can be looked at in many ways. There is no doubt he got hosed by his management. And after Frampton left, Humble Pie's manager, Dee Anthony, kept on managing Peter too, and ended up taking him to the top for a while with the Frampton Comes Alive album. Peter would end up dumping Anthony a few years after that. I think Anthony might have started out wanting to make Steve the star, but once Humble Pie got going and Steve started getting out there a little, Anthony might have started favoring Frampton after he left Humble Pie and went solo. We do know Steve was really upset and said a few times he believed Dee Anthony skimmed money off of Humble Pie's earnings to finance Frampton's career, which is probably true. Steve's wife at the time, Pam Stevens, says that her and Steve went after the money he was owed and run into trouble with the mob. Now I'm going to give my opinion on her story here. First off, she told the story after Steve's death. From what I have read, she said nothing while he was alive. It is true, that D. Anthony had connections with the Genovese crime family, but he was not a member or anything like that. He just had connections. Pam's story said that they were called for a meeting at the famed Ravenite Social Club and was met by some Mafia members naming Paul Castellano and John Gotti as being there, both of them being members of the Gambino crime family. I just don't see it. I think she fabricated the story. Great names to drop, as they had a lot of press coverage through the 80s and 90s. Like I said, there is a connection to D. Anthony and the Genovese crime family, or Genovese, however you want to pronounce it. Here's one more item that might put some of what was said into perspective. Peter Frampton gave an interview, and talking about Anthony, he said that D. Anthony had criminal connections and introduced him to Joey Pagano. He was saying to me, "Look how powerful I am." Peter went on to say that Anthony kept him supplied in drugs and it kept his mind from thinking about his business. Here at least, Joey Pagano was a Genovese family member, and this could very well be true, but he wasn't a Gambino. So my thinking is D. Anthony is basically a thug himself and used a few people he knew in the Mafia to strong-arm musicians, but I don't think it came from the Gambinos. So many managers did this to young guys coming up in the music business. D. Anthony was no exception. Peter Frampton and Steve Marriott were just a few of many who ended up getting the shaft from the likes of guys like Anthony. So I'm not saying that Steve and his wife wasn't told to lay off and forget the money and go home. That could very well have happened, but I do not believe that it happened like his wife told the story. Feel free to give your opinion on it. As I said, this is just mine. Either way, fact is, Steve headed back to England after all his hard work empty-handed, with the exception of a big alcohol and drug addiction problem that would follow him around the rest of his life. I believe this was the turning point in the wrong direction for Steve Marriott. A lot of his mental problems started around this time also. He went back and worked on a solo album and reformed Small Faces without much success in the mid to late 70s. His earnings were used to free him from old binding management contracts. Due to his financial issues, Steve was forced to sell his Beehive Cottage, which had been his home since 1968, and he moved to a small, terraced house in Golders Green, London. After this, Steve basically turned his back on big record companies and management. He would go around playing gigs and work on some simple projects, and even those didn't really pan out for him compared to where he had been. Steve had played around 200 gigs in 1990 when former bandmate Peter Frampton flew into Britain and asked Steve to reform Humble Pie to produce a one-off album and a reunion tour. The money would be enough to allow Marriott to take things easier. He agreed, and they flew out to Frampton's recording studio in Los Angeles in January of 1991. They began writing songs, but sadly the project was never completed. Steve just had a change of heart for some strange reason and returned home. Why? I guess we'll never really know. But it didn't work out. After that, Steve and his wife flew home from the USA on Friday, April 19, 1991, after he had recorded some songs for a future album with Frampton. During the flight, according to his wife, Steve was drinking heavily and in a foul mood, and the two argued constantly. After arriving in the UK, a mutual friend met him, and they all went to one of Steve's favorite restaurants for dinner, where he consumed more alcohol. After dinner, they returned to their friend's house and decided to stay overnight since it was late. But upstairs in bed, Steve and his wife continued to argue. She finally fell asleep and later woke to discover that Steve had taken a taxi home alone. About 6:30 a.m., a passing motorist saw the roof of the Marriott's cottage ablaze and called the fire department. It was reported that 4 fire engines were needed to put the fire out. In newspaper interviews, the assistant divisional fire officer who found Steve Marriott said, "It was a tough fight getting upstairs. We searched the bedroom areas and it was very hot. We knew immediately that no one could have survived the fire. We began to feel around the walls and discovered him lying on the floor between the bed and the wall. I would say he had been in bed and tried to escape. As soon as I saw the body clearly, I knew who it was. I used to be a fan. It's difficult to put my feelings into words. The scene was horrific in that corner of the room. I saw him lying there and thought what a pity it all was. I deal with many fires, but this one was like walking down memory lane. We managed to salvage all of his guitars and musical equipment. I feel a bit upset. All the firemen do. It was like seeing part of our lives gone forever. It is believed that the most likely cause of the fire was that soon after arriving home, jet-lagged and tired in the early hours, Steve had lit a cigarette while in bed and almost immediately fallen asleep. Since he was found lying on the floor between the bed and the wall, investigators concluded that he may have tried unsuccessfully to escape being awakened by the blaze. Disoriented and confused after inhaling large amounts of thick smoke, Steve had turned left instead of right toward the bedroom door in safety. He had been unable to rectify his mistake before being overcome with the smoke. At the inquest, a verdict of accidental death by smoke inhalation was recorded. Steve's blood was found to contain quantities of Valium, alcohol, and cocaine. Steve Marriott was 44 years old at the time of his death. He was married 3 times and said to have had 4 children. He was elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of Small Faces, but this came long after his death. Steve Marriott is a story that just didn't turn out right or have a happy ending no matter how deep you look for it. And that, folks, is just a crying shame. If you have anything to add, please feel free to use the comments section. There's a lot more left unsaid. I just ran out of time here today. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do. Also click on the notification bell and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate it.